Hey everyone, this is Dr. Edwards. Welcome to another video focused on intercultural communication. And today we will talk about barriers to intercultural communication. And this is actually one of my favorite chapters, favorite areas of focus in the textbook because it focuses on what keeps us from communicating with someone of a different culture. So let's dive in. Whenever we talk about stereotypes, I usually like to integrate a scenario or a case study. So just right now, get a piece of paper and write down one culture for which you are a part. And I want to make sure that you know a culture is something for which you identify or you identify with. For example, I am an African American female. I come from Hispanic descent, but I also am a majority Black as my race. But I want to, identify with all of those cultures that I come from. Also, write down two positive stereotypes for that culture. So if I wanted to talk about Black, I would write down two positive stereotypes. And yeah, there are positive stereotypes. Maybe that Black people dance well and that Black people can cook. I don't know. I just made those up. Then also I have two negative stereotypes. Maybe Black people can't learn. Maybe that's a negative stereotype from a historical standpoint. And then also a negative stereotype is I'm not sure. I really don't spend a lot of time thinking about negative stereotypes. I try to be positive most of the time, right? Maybe a negative stereotype is that Black people can't swim. Okay, so I always ask people to write down those positive and negative stereotypes to let you guys know that everyone has stereotypes for a culture that you're part of. So you're part of various stereotypes. However, you can I won't say prove them wrong, but you can exhibit behavior that demystifies or that goes against that stereotype. And usually we do. I mean, sometimes I do play into the stereotype. I can't cook. I really can't cook. So that goes against that positive stereotype. And then also for a negative stereotype, I actually can swim. So it's important to know the stereotypes of your culture so you can know some preconceived notions that other people might have for you. Okay, let's dive in. So the 6 barriers to intercultural communication. So they are anxiety, assuming similarity instead of difference, also ethnocentrism, stereotypes and prejudice, nonverbal misrepresentations, and also or misinterpretation, and also language. So anxiety basically means that you have literally psychological anxiety before you communicate with someone of a different culture. And I will not stand here and tell you guys that I'm perfect. I don't. I do also have anxiety when it comes to communicating with someone of a different culture, especially if I do not have a good grasp of the language. Also, assuming similarity instead of difference. It's important to know that even though I see someone who is of my same race who's Black, a common barrier to intercultural communication is to assume that I am the same as a person who looks like me. However, there are a lot of differences between people who do look alike. So you should start with a blank slate and then to figure out in which areas you're similar and also in which areas you are different. Also, that's also playing to the ethnocentrism piece. So again, if I go to a different part of Texas and I'm like, oh my goodness, you guys don't have a Whataburger or you guys don't have a Kroger, what is wrong with you guys? I think that Corpus Christi does not actually have a Kroger. So, I would not move to Corpus Christi because, that would be an ethnocentric piece of me. Basically, if you don't have a Kroger, I'm not moving there because I think, all cities should have a Kroger. So that's an ethnocentric way of addressing that. And I could be missing a great opportunity in Corpus Christi, but they have a great HEB. So I found that out as well. Number 4 is, being ethnocentric or exhibiting ethnocentrism is basically thinking that the world should act or react or to think the same way that we do. Also, we have stereotypes and prejudice. We talked about that in previous chapters, but stereotypes basically prejudice basically means prejudging someone based on a variety of factors, and usually it's a very inflexible category. You can't commonly get out of a prejudice at all. Black people are this, or all people who are GLBT are this, but that is a prejudice that comes into play. Race, those are based primarily on color words. Prejudice can follow any part of culture. But also stereotypes can be positive or they can be negative. Prejudice is usually just negative. And so stereotypes, to know that you're placing people in a category as well, but it could either be a positive or negative thing. And remember, prejudice is mostly negative. Okay, nonverbal misinterpretations basically means that if someone, I talked about this in a previous video, but if someone has their hands, their fingertips touching and their palms basically forming a triangle, if I see someone doing this, I know to end the conversation because whatever I am talking about makes them very uncomfortable, but I could be misinterpreting that. I've never asked the person who does this usually, does this mean that you are uncomfortable? But maybe I'm misinterpreting what this person is saying. I almost said the gender. Also, last but not least, language. I only know 2 languages. However, if I encountered someone who did not speak one of those 2 languages that I know, then language would definitely be a barrier for me because I could not properly communicate with that person in a verbal context or in a verbal environment. Okay, so let's move on to Semmel's uncertainty reduction theory, and I usually refer to this as URT. That basically means when you're interacting with a person and the goal is to reduce your uncertainty about that person. And think about this. If you're sitting next to someone on a plane or on a bus, on a Greyhound bus, and you do not know anyone on the bus, you're sitting next to someone you do not know, and you are on an 8-hour journey. So if you're going to be sitting next to that person, you want to find out something about them, especially if you are in it for the long haul. So you will usually reduce your uncertainty by finding out where they're from, what they do, things of that nature. So that makes you more comfortable with the people that you're riding next to. But the uncertainty reduction theory basically means you communicate with the purpose of reducing your uncertainty about that person or things you don't know about that person. Okay, so with assuming similarity and difference instead of difference. And let me make that a little bit smaller for you guys so it makes it a little bit easier. But let's see. There we are. Okay, so this just gives a couple of examples with Japanese and also U.S. co-workers. 8% of individuals in the U.S. were impatient with the Japanese, and they had a high level of anxiety, but 30% of the Japanese had a high level of anxiety. So when it comes to potential with only 8% of the people thought that the Japanese thought that they were, only 8% of the people in the U.S., whenever they're working with the Japanese in a workplace, they thought that they were impatient with the Japanese. But 30% of the Japanese actually thought that they were impatient. So perception of anxiety can be different than actual anxiety. Also, assuming similarity instead of difference. We talked about that before, we talked about how you should ask questions instead of just assuming that you're similar. There's an example about music, and so with music, you can think that you both listen to music the same, but different countries listen to music very differently. In the U.S., we listen to music in a group, and in other countries, you listen to music when you're alone. Moving on, ethnocentrism basically means that we are... Everyone, let's keep going. So let's talk about the stereotypes of prejudice. So remember, prejudice, or being prejudiced, is prejudging someone based on something that you have seen on television or that you've experienced or something that you've heard about another culture. So remember, prejudice is a negative thing, but it can also... The thing about prejudice is you can change your prejudices for someone, but all prejudice is a negative thing. So let's dig into ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism basically means that you're judging another person's culture based on your own cultural experiences. So for instance, if a Texan goes to the north and rents an Airbnb and basically says, I don't see how people survive without air conditioning. If you have a house without air conditioning, your house is trash. that is an example of ethnocentrism because you're judging other people's culture based on your culture. But someone from the north could come to the south and realize that we do not have basements, and they think that our house is a waste of space. So that could be another version of reverse ethnocentrism as well. Also, cultural relativism basically means that you understand someone's culture in the context or in the environment of their culture before we judge it. So again, if we are someone from Texas and we go to the north and we realize that that a certain state does not have air conditioning or a certain city does not have air conditioning, we actually try to understand that they have mostly cold climates and it only reaches maybe 75 degrees as a high instead of the 105 degrees that we're used to down here. Then you can realize in their context, it's not worth it to install air conditioning. It's worth it to have a furnace instead of air conditioning. So that's a cultural relativism piece. So cultural nearsightedness basically means taking one's own culture for granted and neglecting other cultures. So if you are in Texas and if you basically say that everyone who is in Texas should speak English, then that could be an example of cultural nearsightedness. I know that plenty of people say it, but that could be basically neglecting another person's culture. So if I want to speak Spanish to my family, then if someone says that all people in Texas should speak English, that could be a perception of cultural nearsightedness. Or if I go to Mexico and people in Mexico or people in France or people in, are people in, let me think of another country. Okay, people in Brazil or people in Portugal. They all speak different languages, but if we go to Portugal and we do not speak Portuguese, and the Portuguese basically tell us that if you speak English, you should not come here because if you come here, you should know basic statements in Portuguese, then that could also be another example of cultural nearsightedness. Okay, so in Mexico, for example, it is common to have two last names. So that basically means that I would have Jennifer Roberts Edwards. So Roberts is my maiden name. Edwards is my married name. And that's an example here. But my daughter my maiden name is Roberts. Her dad's name is Edwards. So my daughter would have my daughter's name, Roberts Edwards, as her last names. And it makes sense, to people created a person, but in the US, it is commonly not a thing. And so in the 90s and also in the early 2000s and sometimes today, there's not a space in an application for a second last name. And so that is also potentially another version of cultural nearsightedness, but to know, that other cultures live and communicate differently. Okay, so extreme ethnocentrism basically means that you are potentially rejecting knowledge. So if you basically say, I'm not going to interact with anyone who does not look, think, or talk like I do, could be an example of extreme ethnocentrism, and that could lead to a rejection of learning something new. All right, we're going to keep going. Okay, this is one of my favorite films. We will not watch it, but you have an opportunity to watch it when you go to the PowerPoint. But basically, it is the color of, no, is it The Color of Fear? I'm forgetting the actual name of the documentary, but basically it was the Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes experiment, and it's really, really neat, and so it's available on YouTube. Okay, moving on. So we talked about stereotypes, we talked about prejudice, we also, just another thing, there are a few colleges and universities that also have a mascot that is a culture. And so this has been a point of communication throughout the past few years to figure out if some mascots are going to stay or if they're going to go. Also, the cultural sensitivity is basically not making value judgments on another person's culture, and then you have profiling, scrutinizing certain individuals based on characteristics that they're likely to have a certain behavior. So if I'm profiling people based on a likelihood. Okay, for instance, if I am walking down the street and I see someone who looks a certain way and I go to the other side of the street because people who look like that are likely to rob me, then that is an example of profiling. So it happens every day, but basically to know what it is and to know to avoid profiling because everyone does not exhibit those characteristics. Okay, so also stereotypes can impede communication in various ways. So one way is that it can cause us to assume that a widely held belief is true when it may not be. Also, use of the stereotype reinforces the belief. So if you tell it to yourself or you tell it to others so many times, it can reinforce that it is true when it is actually potentially not true. Also, it can impede communication when the stereotypes cause us to assume a widely held belief is true of any one individual. So basically, if you think that, all black people can dance or all Hispanic people or all white people can do X or Y, then that can impede your communication because you can think that a person is capable of doing this, but they're actually not able to do that. And also it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That basically means that, another one is that all people of Asian descent are smart. And so that is not the case for any culture. And so it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy by saying, oh, well, if I'm not smart, then, this could be a negative thing and that could cause, some potential psychological occurrences as well. Moving on. Speaking of Asian Americans in the 2000 census, according to the 2000 census, the Asian American model minority myth, like I just said, it is a myth that all people of a certain cultural group are either all smart or all not smart, then that is a model minority myth for Asian Americans. But in the 2000 census, sorry guys, I don't have updated information, but I will look it up. But it was the fastest growing segment on welfare, and also 1 out of 7 Asian Americans lacks a high school diploma. And then because of that, Asian Americans have historically been pushed by educators into math and science when maybe that is not their forte. Maybe their forte is in writing or in music. And also for Prejudice, an authoritative or authoritarian personality basically means that people overgeneralize things in bipolar terms. So it's either hot or cold, or it's either yes or no. You can't be a somewhat, but basically it's for example, an authoritarian personality basically means that there's no gray area, that either you are or you're not. And also, if you think about the concept of culture, especially with all these DNA tests that have come out recently, and I've taken those as well, but with those DNA tests, we are all comprised of so many different cultures. And so maybe an authoritarian personality is like you're either white or black, and there's no in between, and it's very bipolar, but the world isn't made that way. Also, it's interesting, after reading this textbook over 10 years ago, well, and there have been a lot of different versions, and that's why I use the library databases, because they're more up-to-date than any textbook, I'm just saying. But the Roma culture is a moving culture, so it's very interesting. In some instances, the Roma culture are also called gypsies. But it is very interesting that a moving culture still keeps that sense of culture no matter where they are. So historically, I think they were first documented in India and then Europe, and then the Roma culture is everywhere. And also, there's a large Roma culture in Texas as well, and I think it's really neat. Let's see. And I think that's it. And this is the other part of the Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes documentary, which is one of my favorites. And that is it. And the neat thing is, if you can find it, there's another part of this documentary that highlights what the students were like 10 years or I think 20 years down the road. So it was very interesting. And they talk about how this experiment or experience affected them in a positive and also negative way. All right, guys, so again, we have talked about the barriers to intercultural communication. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I am at drjt Edwards on Twitter and also on Instagram. And also, if you feel the need to reach out to me on email, I am jtedwards@tarleton.edu. Have a good day, everyone, and I will see you soon.